Welcome to the fourth session of our 2022-2023 Heritage and Colonialism Discussion Group. This year's talks center around the theme Legacies of Injustice. The theme encompasses a broad range of injustices in both the past and the present, which are connected to a web of colonial issues.
Without further delay, we would like to warmly welcome today's speaker, Jack Ashby. Jack is the Assistant Director of the University Museum of Zoology, Cambridge. His work centers on engaging people with the natural world, chiefly through museums, and the colonial biases that museums often exhibit. His new book, Platypus Matters, The Extraordinary Story of Australian Mammals, celebrates these iconic animals, explores how the wider world came to know them, and asks how these histories impact on their conservation today. He is currently an Art Fund Headley Fellow, researching the colonial histories of the Australian mammal collections in Cambridge. He is also a trustee of the Natural Sciences Collections Association and an honorary research fellow in UCL Science and Technology Studies. Jack's topic today is Legacies of Colonial Violence and Injustice in Natural History Museums. Welcome, Jack. The floor is yours.
Hi, thanks, Stanley, Ria, and Isabella for having me, and thanks everyone else for coming today. I'm just gonna my screen straight. Hopefully you can see my PowerPoint presentation now. Is that looking right? Great, thank you. So yeah, the field of decolonial practice in natural history museums, I think, is relatively young compared to other parts of the cultural heritage sector. It's really kicked off coincidentally here in Cambridge in 2017, I think, when Subhadra Das and Miranda Lowe gave their what's now become the seminal paper, Nature Read in Black and White, which really kind of lit a bit of a fire in the natural history sector to make clear that, yes, obviously we have really, really important scientific collections, but also that we've got cultural history as well. And I know, I'm sure that's really, really obvious. But honestly, in the natural history sector, we really hadn't been talking a great deal about thinking about our collections from a colonial, from the viewpoint of colonialism. And for me, the question we get asked constantly in natural history museums and other museums is where did you get all this stuff? And I think perhaps 10 years ago, people were asking that question wide-eyed, where did you get all this stuff? But now more people are asking kind of, where did you get all this stuff? And really thinking about the stories that were involved in collecting natural history collections. And for me, I guess when we're looking specifically at violence in natural history collections, I think there's a bit of a spectrum. I'm not sure if it's important. There's a bit of a spectrum from people that were collecting during the act of invasion, so soldiers and other kind of military and other instruments of colonial movements as they were arriving and as they were expanding the frontier. People were collecting and sending back to museums. On the screen at the moment, that's Pemel Way, who's the Eora resistance leader in what's now New South Wales. He was killed during a resistance fight, and his head was sent back to Joseph Banks in London. And in fact, an Aboriginal Australian's head was on a list of things that Joseph Banks wanted alongside platypuses. So platypuses are kind of my area of zoology, and the whole species, the understanding of the whole species is now kind of tied up in the history of colonialism in this way that those specimens were collected. So that's kind of one end, collecting during the act of the invasion on the spectrum. The other is collecting the other end is collecting in a post-frontier landscape, where people have already been dispossessed of their land and that settlement has happened, and collecting is being done by farmers or really anyone working kind of after this act of colonialism. I'm just going to start with a little example of perhaps the first end of the spectrum, that violence during an act of invasion. And this comes from a paper that I put together with Rebecca Machin at Leeds City Museum Art Gallery, who our paper is called Legacies of Colonial Violence in Natural History Museums. Legacies of Violence in Natural History Museums. I can share the link at the end. But in answering that question, where did you get all this stuff? I think it's not an unusual example, but it is a surprising one. And I don't think it's the answer that people would expect. So this is a spring hare. It's an African hopping rodent, not too different in size to a hare, but not related to them very closely at all. So this specimen, it turns out, was collected at Vredefort Road in 1901. Vredefort Road was a British-run concentration camp during the Second Boer War. And it was collected by a British army officer called Gerald Barrett Hamilton. And he was one of the people administering the concentration camps. So for those of you who don't know, and to be honest, when I started writing this story, I didn't know anything about the history of the Boer War. I'm a zoologist by training. So any history I come across is kind of accidental. But during the Boer War was essentially a war between two white colonial powers, the British and the Boers in South Africa, which are French, German, Huguenot descendant people, over gold in South Africa. So the British invaded in order to take control of mineral exports. They used the argument of wanting to end the slave trade or other persecution of South African peoples, but there's clearly also an economic argument. And the way they fought the war was through a scorched earth policy of burning farms and people's livelihoods in order to stop them from being able to support guerrilla fighters and shelter the guerrilla fighters. So it created a massive refugee crisis of Boer people, of Black South Africans, of people who, men and women men who couldn't fight, and women and children who were driven into concentration camps. And by the end of the war, over 40,000 civilians had died in the camps alone, let alone those who died outside of the camps. And in the context of that humanitarian crisis, there were army officers running the camps who were also collecting natural history specimens in their leisure time. Now, on reflection, that's not that surprising because people have interests and they were there stationed in an interesting part of the world. So it's perhaps not surprising, but at the other end, it's not something I imagined was happening when I started looking at this. So Barrett Hamilton sent here to Cambridge just a few handful of specimens, but over 1,000 birds to the Natural History Museum in London, and also thousands of insects to what's now the South African Museum in Cape Town. So this was at quite a grand scale. And I as I say, I raise this as I don't think this is the kind of answer that people would necessarily expect to that "where do you get all this stuff" question. Beyond the kind of humanitarian cultural consideration, there's also this letter in our archive, which is written between two people who work. So the superintendent writing to the curator, or the other way around. It's kind of like internal email. And of an aardvark that came along with the spring hare, it says, of course, the beast is now rigorously protected and scheduled, but soldiers in Boerland can and may do many things. So this talks also about how soldiers are not necessarily following kind of the conservation laws that are in place at the time. So this is 1901, so it's interesting that even that early there were wildlife regulations protecting aardvarks, but the soldiers collected them and the museum accepted them nonetheless. So this is a couple of years ago during lockdown project for Rebecca and I write this paper up. In recent years, I've been looking at, in the last 9 months, been looking at the colonial history of our Australian mammal collection. Australian mammals are my corner of zoology. And these are all very much works in progress, so I'd be very interested to hear any reflections in the Q&A that anyone has. These are a few of the topics that I'm looking at into my Headley Fellowship, generously supported by the Art Fund, to whom I'm very grateful. And the first one is this, and I will give you a warning here that this story involves some rather unpleasant details, most of which I'll spare you of, about mutilation of Aboriginal remains. So if you do not want to hear any of that, feel free to, there's no images covering that, but feel free to mute until you see this slide change as I move on to the next story. So these specimens in this photograph are thylacines, which are perhaps the most famous example of modern day extinctions. They were the largest marsupial carnivore of modern times, very much shaped like a dog or a wolf, but separated from them by 160 million years of evolution. They are, let's say, marsupials. So they're far more closely related to kangaroos, koalas, wombats than they are to dogs. The starkest difference, perhaps I should have shown you a picture of a live one. The starkest difference is that they're stripy. But this, the last known individual thylacine died in 1936 in a zoo in Hobart, Tasmania, and they are now extinct. The collection here is probably one of the best preserved groups of thylacine skins in the world. We have 6, 5 of which were sent by a solicitor working in Hobart called Morton Alport. And Alport, I'm concluding that Alport is essentially responsible for sending more thylacines to Europe than any other individual. In fact, this collection that we have in Cambridge is the largest collection of thylacines known to be amassed by any single person single name person in the world. So these are really valuable, important collections for connecting people with concepts of extinction. This was a deliberate extinction brought about by several bounty systems that were lobbied for by the sheep farming industry. So Tasmania was invaded in 1803, and one of its primary industries was sheep farming. The farmers blamed thylacines for killing large numbers of sheep. So as I say, they're a predatory carnivore, and they instigated the first bounty against thylacines in 1830. And the government, that was a sheep farming corporation, introduced a private bounty in 1830. The government followed suit in 1888 with a government-sponsored bounty. They were extinct. Well, the last known individual died, as I say, in 1936, so just a little over 100 years after that first bounty. They certainly didn't go extinct in 1936, most likely in the last few decades they went extinct, but they just haven't been seen or collected since then reliably. So as I say, these are really important specimens for connecting us with stories of extinction, but the story I was following is in my Headley research is into Morton Alport. Now, Alport, having read, is known for being involved in the export of Indigenous remains from Tasmania. And what I've been looking at is the parallels between the story of the thylacine and of Aboriginal Tasmanians in the 19th century. Also in 1830, so the same year that the first bounty on thylacines was introduced, with the first bounty on Aboriginal Tasmanian people. So both thylacines and Aboriginal Tasmanians were seen as pests in their native environment who threatened the economy of the fledgling colony. But there's quite a lot more to those parallels than that, which I don't really have time to go into, but the way that they were represented as their numbers declined and as the Tasmanian genocide was committed are quite stark. So although there was a series of military exercises and non-military exercised against Aboriginal Tasmanians, by the 1860s, the number of people that were identified as problematically identified as full-blooded, air quotes, Aboriginal people could be counted on your fingers. So when the last man to be identified as a full-blooded Aboriginal Tasmanian named William Lunny died in 1869, and then in 1873, Truganini, the last Aboriginal woman, the last Aboriginal person in Tasmania, they identified, the race was declared extinct. I could go into details about everything that the colonists did in order to reach that point, but it was a deliberate extirpation. In reality, of course, as I'm sure many of you know, Aboriginal Tasmanians are not extinct and number in the thousands today. What the 19th century colonists chose to ignore across the world, and in fact, right up until the 1970s, the narrative was established that that people had gone extinct in Tasmania. In reality, women had been kidnapped by sealers and whalers and taken to islands in the Bass Strait between Tasmania and mainland Australia. And the descendants of those whalers and sealers and those Aboriginal women today number in the thousands, making up the today's Aboriginal community in Tasmania. But the narrative was that they went extinct. And what's one of the many interesting things about the parallels between the stories of the marsupial and the people is the extent to which they were blamed. They were both blamed for their extinction as for being inferior and primitive and generally hierarchically less able to deal with the modern world once Europeans arrived. Of course, if you go around shooting people and taking them to offshore islands where there's no food or fresh water, to blame them for dying of those things is obviously ludicrous. Similarly, thylacines were painted as primitive, as all marsupials were painted as primitive in really unbiologically sensible ways. And that was also blamed for their extinction, despite the fact that thousands of them were killed under a bounty system. The reason that Alport is the story here, and I'm going perhaps into more detail than I have time for, is that Alport claimed to be the main exporter of Aboriginal remains to Europe in the 19th century. So I've read a few hundred of his letters, and he makes a great deal of the fact that both populations of thylacines and people were declining, which made their remains desirable for museum objects. And he, I found in his letters, effectively was offering institutions in Europe specimens in order to, in direct exchange. Explicitly, he was saying as a quid pro quo arrangement, I will send you specimens from Tasmania if you give me letters after my name, if you give me scientific recognition. And when he died, his obituary described him as the most foremost scientist in the colony, despite the fact that his scientific contribution was basically zero, beyond sending specimens without data, so not very scientific, without data to several European institutions, including Cambridge, Natural History Museum, and the Royal National Institute of Science in Brussels. He, it turns out, was involved in the mutilation of Aboriginal remains, particularly of William Lanney, who was, as I say, identified at the time as the last male Aboriginal person, and certainly of grave robbing by robbing Aboriginal people's graves, some of which have been long dead, some of which were people that he knew personally before they had died, and sending them to museums. And he was very proud of this fact that he was the main exporter of these remains to European collections. So although we rightly celebrate these thylacines as real treasures of the museum, it's impossible for me now, knowing what I know, to look at them without thinking about these violent histories of the genocide in Tasmania that was associated with them, and the fact that both thylacines and Aboriginal people were deliberately persecuted and considered pests in their environment in which they'd lived for thousands of years. So that's one particularly grim story from my research. The next one is a little less grim, but certainly nonetheless was still problematic. So this is a collection that I came across that had not been incorporated into our collection, that had arrived in the 1990s from another part of the university. And all it had to identify it was this piece of paper that says list of marsupials from Expedition 2, Central Australia, presented in the 3rd of September 1900 by Elliot Smith, Grafton Elliot Smith, who might be known to any anthropologically minded people as an eminent anthropologist and also zoologist. He was here in this department, or at least in anatomy, for several years at the turn of the century. He's an Australian by birth. And this collection is really exciting because it has specimens that are now extinct in it. This on the right is a lesser bilby, which is a burrowing omnivorous marsupial that went extinct in the 1960s. And the one on the bottom left is a kawari, which is a kind of squirrel-sized carnivorous marsupial, and which was actually described for the first time by Europeans following this expedition. That I didn't say this has to be the Horn expedition to Central Australia, which was the first scientific expedition to that part of the world. And it described a number of interesting species. What the angle that I am following with this is that these collections and the many other collections that exist in museums from the Horn expedition around the world. So, as I say, it was a very important expedition. A number of museums, particularly in Australia, have Horn expedition material. What I find particularly interesting about it is firstly who was given credit for the specimen collecting, but also where it places these collections in the history of colonial Australia. And what happened is that the expedition based itself out of a telegraph station called Charlotte Waters. And Charlotte Waters has a station master called Patrick or Paddy Byrne, and Paddy Byrne was given a huge amount of credit for either collecting specimens or hosting the expedition. So they stayed there whilst the expedition was out, and then in the several years, in fact decades following the expedition, Paddy Byrne continued to send specimens from Charlotte Waters down to William Baldwin Spencer in Melbourne. And Spencer is one of Australia's leading historical zoologists, and he describes a number of species. And everything you can find published about the Horn expedition gives no indication that anyone other than the expedition members and Paddy Byrne are doing any of the collecting. So following the expedition, which is in 1894, Spencer describes this new species, which is actually the kowari in the bottom left there. And he says, "My warmest thanks are due to my friend, Mr. P.M. Byrne, who, under the difficulties of collecting and transit, which cannot be fully appreciated unless one has personally endeavoured to collect in Central Australia during the hot season, secured specimens which are now described." Every other account, of the 4 papers that come out of that expedition, everything is describing Byrne as the collector. But I've been digging into the letters of that Byrne had sent Spencer, of which there are many over those decades, that he sent alongside specimens. It's really clear that Byrne likely didn't collect a single specimen. And in fact, it was all Southern Arrente, Aboriginal women, who were stationed around Charlotte Waters. So this is just one kind of line of evidence of many in the letters that show that it was Aboriginal women that were collecting on there, that he was staying at the station whilst Aboriginal people were sent out to collect things. From the letters, you can tell also that it was Aboriginal people that were deciding what to collect. So there's some agency there, although on occasion Byrne would say, "Can you get me some more of these?" So this is, actually Spencer thought this was a new species, the lesser bilby. It turns out it wasn't, but nonetheless, it's a valuable specimen because it was described from the invalid species is described from this specimen. In fact, the quote here is talking about them spilling the spirits, which may explain why the skin has slipped on this specimen. So they started to decompose and the hair has fallen out on the back of the bilby. So that's one story, is that there is unacknowledged Aboriginal labour and Aboriginal expertise, but in our collections. So they're given, the colonial white men have been given the credit, but it's actually Aboriginal women who've made major contributions to the history of science, and that's obviously important because our museums, in not acknowledging that, make themselves much less relevant in terms of who they represent. And I think if people were to go into museums and realise that a greater diversity of people contributed to the history of science and the history of our collections, then museums would speak to them as places that are for them and about them much better than they do today. Another line of this story is about Charlotte Waters and how the business and industry and infrastructure of the colonial enterprise shaped how natural history was done and what natural history was possible. So Charlotte Waters, as I said, was a telegraph station, The overground telegraph line in Australia was connected in 1872. It connected Adelaide on the south coast to Darwin on the north coast. This is, I think, one of the most significant moments in Australian colonial history, because what happens when Adelaide in the south, and then by connection, Adelaide was connected to Sydney and Melbourne. When that line is connected via underwater cables to Java and then the rest of Eurasia, Australia stops being an isolated colony on the far side of the world. It goes in the connecting of a cable. It goes from it taking 4 months to send a letter to Australia to it taking minutes to send a letter. So you can actually have conversations in real time. And Charlotte Waters was built because in order to carry the electrical signal across thousands of kilometers of Central Australia, they had to build repeater stations every 250 kilometers. There are 11 repeater stations across Australia. And Charlotte Waters was one of them. And those stations became the frontier in Central Australia. So they caused the colonization of Australia, of Central Australia, and they caused the dispossession of people in Central Australia. So they, as I say, they were the frontier. That they had maintenance teams, they had station masters like Paddy Burns, and then thousands of stock and their stockmen were brought with them. So they became the settlements. And this means that obviously expeditions could then travel to these places as bases, and it ties our specimens, it makes our specimens emblems of the colonization of Central Australia and the dispossession of Aboriginal Australians, who then generally moved towards the stations, having been dispossessed of their lands as agricultural economy was set up on their land. They moved towards the stations because they had water bores and a steady supply of water, which meant that there was the labour power there and the expertise on hand to collect for people like Byrne. Byrne, was not a military man. He was not a policeman. He was kind of an agent of. He was a telegraph operator, a relatively innocuous position in the society. However, he was responsible for dispersing their government rations, and it seems from his letters that he was exchanging government rations to which people were already entitled for specimens, which is, I guess, questionable. I think I've been talking for 25 minutes, so I think I will stop there. I have other examples where, again, published records make no indication that Aboriginal people were collecting, but obviously, well, it's not a surprise, I guess, that people were taking credit for other people's labour. But wherever people have gone in Australia, certainly on the mainland, and collected specimens, they have relied heavily on the knowledge and labour of people who lived there for 50 or 60,000 years, and haven't given those people the credit that they deserve. And I think that's something that's really important that we start to do to make our collections more relevant to a wider people, and also a wider group of people, and also just to be honest about where our collections came from. So I shall stop there. I think I've stopped. Green Chang.
Thank you.